Welcome everybody. I'm here to introduce Kyle Shaughnessy. Kyle is a recipient of a fellowship from the Chair in Transgender Studies. He's a two-spirit person, a trans person, mixed Indigenous, and the Indigenous part is Dene, and European ancestry. As a social worker and a writer originally from the Northwest Territories and rural BC, with a strong background in public speaking, education, community building, and youth advocacy. Kyle is currently completing his MSW at Dalhousie University on the other end of the country, focusing his thesis work on two-spirit pedagogy, and he works on this end of the country with Transcare BC as the education lead for Indigenous communities and children, youth, and families. So the title is Teaching and Learning Two-Spirit, Decolonizing Gender Diversity Education. So please join me in welcoming Kyle Shaughnessy.
So before I begin, I do also just want to reiterate and express my gratitude and my acknowledgement, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasatch people for tolerating my presence on this territory this week. I was invited here to speak, but not necessarily by the people whose territory we're on today. So I just want to extend that gratitude for the tolerance of my presence, again, because that wasn't a direct invitation. And I just want to express my intention to be a good guest and conduct myself in a good way while I'm on this territory. Typically, I'd like to spend about 5-10 minutes on territorial acknowledgement when I do a talk. We're only going to be talking, well, I am only going to be talking for about 45 minutes or so today, so I'm just going to move on. But typically, I do like to spend a little bit longer and then also engage the room in a discussion about the relationship to the territory and two-spirit communities. So if you're ever in the position where you can attend a talk again, that's something that we'll try to do. Merci. Again, my name is Kyle. I am, again, of mixed European and Indigenous ancestry. So my Indigenous side is Dene from the Yellowknife, NWT. And that side of my family is the Khoisan side, so we're Dogrib, and I have many artists, speakers, performers, and laborers on that side of my family. My cousin is actually going to be also doing a performance here later this week, which is really exciting. You've probably seen the posters around. And then so on the other side of my family is where my last name comes from, is Irish, and they've been here 4 generations. So I do identify personally as both transgender and two-spirit. It is very important to me to articulate that I identify both as two-spirit and trans because those are very distinct identities for me. And I think for a lot of folks, it's very easy to lump all two-spirit people into one blanket because I mean the term in some ways can also serve similarly to the word queer. It can be a bit of an umbrella term. And it's important to me to designate that because not all two-spirit people identify as trans. So I do identify as trans. That's been a very major aspect to my life. And I do also identify as two-spirit, which of course we're going to talk a lot about in a bit. So I am also a social worker. So I graduated from the BSW program at UVic here in 2008. So I did a presentation the other day at the School of Social Work, which was really cool to go back and come full circle and see all the folks there again, invited by Cindy to be able to go into that talk. I do work in the public health sector as a two-spirit educator and transgender youth advocate. I've been working with transgender and two-spirit youth in varying capacities, supporting in community in general, since before we were able to have paid jobs doing stuff like this, since about 15 years ago, so it feels like quite a while. And before I get talking, I also want to acknowledge that so many of the teachings that I'm sharing with you today are not things that I just came up with or necessarily researched on my own. They are teachings that were shared with me by other two-spirit educators, teachers, and folks who've had a large influence on my life. So I do just want to acknowledge my teachers along the way are Harlan Gruden, who is a Cree community organizer and educator, Dr. Salish Wesley, who is Stolo and a community advocate and educator, Chase Willier, who is a Cree local community leader, Dr. Sarah Hunt, who is Quag Youth and UBC instructor, and Jean-Baptiste, who is Wet'suwet'en and a community activist and leader, as well as my mom, Kathy Khoisan. She's hilarious and she tells a really good story, so she's been a huge influence on me and just the way I conduct myself. And so, moving on, so about me, this is a photo of this butterfly, which is here on my arm. I first told the story about this butterfly the very first time I did a presentation at UVic at the Trans Archives Moving Trans History Forward conference last March. And so this butterfly was gifted to me by my grandmother when I was very little. Can anyone, just based on the shape of it, do you know what it is? Can you tell what it is? Like what the purpose of this butterfly is? And I don't mean anything deep, I mean like actually like functionally what does it do? Like what's it for?
Is it a hairpiece?
Yes. Yeah, so it's called a bun cover. And so it's something that you're supposed to like, you have your hair in a ponytail or a bun and then you put it over and a little stick goes through it. So this was gifted to me when I was a little girl. I was about 3 or 4 and I used to wear it all the time. It was one of my favorite objects. I kept on to it. I mean, I'd lose track of it for a year or two at a time when I was a teenager, but it's always been with me throughout my life. So as part of transition, cutting my hair was an important aspect to my transition, and so I don't have long hair anymore, so this is not necessarily something I can use for that same purpose. And so I've just had to find other ways to repurpose it to be able to have it as a piece that I carry forward with me. And this is just a part of my body or an aspect of my body that I feel I carry my masculinity in this part of my body. So this is, and also as a speaker, it's part of my body that I use a lot. So this is an important part of me, so I like to carry this right here now. So yeah, that's the story of my butterfly. So today's presentation, I can't see this on here, so this is very I keep checking back to make sure it's still up there. So today's presentation, we're gonna be going over some basic concepts in Two-Spirit knowledge, Two-Spirit history and colonization, decolonizing gender diversity education. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my research that I'm gonna be doing over the next little while as part of my MSW studies. It's on Two-Spirit teaching and learning as healing. And then we're gonna go into a little bit of what Two-Spirit reclamation and resurgence looks like. And I'm gonna get to talk about some of the folks who've really influenced my work as well. And then we're gonna have some time for Q&A. So, just to go into a little bit of basic Two-Spirit knowledge, so we're going to talk a little bit about Two-Spirit. So how many folks in the room feel like they have a pretty good understanding of what Two-Spirit is? Like, is it a fairly familiar concept here? Mm-hmm. All right, so there's a lot of sort of like basic knowledge. How many folks in the room feel like this is sort of their first time really being part of a talk or anything on Two-Spirit? Okay, great, so mixed bag, that's wonderful. Okay. I think that this is probably going to get at everyone because we do a little bit of deeper exploration of what Two-Spirit means, but then we also do some more like sort of intro level stuff. So I hope that everyone's able to sort of come along at the same pace. So what is Two-Spirit? So Two-Spirit is an Indigenous specific concept, and it incorporates both diverse genders and sexualities. So it is actually quite distinct from LGBT from a Western framework. Of gender and sexual diversity. So it's definitely not the same thing because it has those cultural, spiritual components involved. And also one thing about LGBT is it's very separate, it's very segregated off from mainstream society a lot of the time, so we'll have our own specific streets, neighborhoods, community centers, as an LGBTQ community. However, Two-Spirit is a little bit more embedded in the culture ideally. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. So historically, most nations across Turtle Island did have Two-Spirit people. Many of the origin stories of Two-Spirit people in each nation are based in some sort of reincarnation story. So Turtle Island has, Two-Spirit people all across the board. And they have different language depending on their nation. They each have their own unique roles and gifts and names. So again, one of the folks that I named as a teacher of mine is Harlan Pruden, and he's actually collected, I think it's around like 200 terms or something for what Two-Spirit means in each nation. And I mean, there's gonna be several different words and descriptors depending on the nation, depending on the actual gender role or gender diversity of that person in the nation. But Two-Spirit actually will have a different word and a different name depending on the nation. So in terms of origin stories, so for instance, the Dene origin story is that Two-Spirit people came to be when a mother was pregnant with a child, and then the spirit of an opposite gender person in the community would enter that mother's womb, and then when the baby was born, they housed both genders of spirits. So that's sort of the tale from Dene. Unfortunately, I don't have much knowledge about Dene Two-Spirit, and again, we're going to talk a little bit about some of our stories have disappeared over time, and it's quite a lot of work. on Indigenous people to uncover some of our stories around our Two-Spirit histories. So I'm sort of in that process right now, but that's one real gem of information that I have been able to gather from Dene stories. Okay, we'll move on. So historically, and even today really, Two-Spirit people do occupy some pretty incredible roles within their communities, as healers, as medicine people, as matchmakers, also as mediators, and marriage counselors is something that they were often asked to do because they were thought to be able to see both sides of a story. And if you've attended a Two-Spirit talk before, done any learning around Two-Spirit, you've probably heard the phrase highly revered used. So Two-Spirit people were quite highly revered in their communities, and also at the same time, in many communities, they were just embedded into the culture and embedded into the community as gifted folks because there were other gifted people in the communities. And I think that by today's standards, sometimes we look back at historically the meaning that Two-Spirit people had in their communities and we think, oh, that's incredible. Mm-hmm. But honestly, it's by today's standards because we've had to fight so hard as LGBTQ people to be recognized in our community, to have safety, to have that space carved out, that by comparison, it can sometimes feel like Two-Spirit people were highly revered, which in some cases and in some communities, yes, they were, but not always. In a lot of communities, they were just sort of integrated members of the community thought to be just as gifted as many other people. So not all folks who are Indigenous and gender or sexually diverse will identify as Two-Spirit. So there's going to be a lot of reasons for that. So one of those being that it's a relatively recent term. So not everyone knows it, especially when if folks in the room who are working with youth might know this, is that not all Indigenous youth who identify as gender and sexually diverse are actually going to know the term Two-Spirit. They might be identifying with other terms like pansexual or bi or trans. And that might be just because they haven't had the opportunity to actually learn that language, to learn about the concept. And it also might be, for a lot of folks, youth included, that it's just not a term that resonates with them. It just doesn't fit with their self-concept, and that's cool too. People are not obligated to identify as Two-Spirit, and I think that when we're considering our roles as allies to Two-Spirit and Indigenous folks, ensuring that we're never in the position that Indigenous folks who don't identify as Two-Spirit feel pressured to or feel an obligation to identify with that cultural identity. If it doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for them, and that's okay too. For some folks who are Indigenous and don't identify as Two-Spirit, but are sort of considering it and thinking about it and involving themselves in it, but are not taking on that name, it might be because they feel that they have a certain responsibility or a gift that they want to be able to offer their community, and that's just not a place that they're at yet. They may feel like they want to do a little bit more searching within themselves, searching outside of themselves for what it is that they can offer in the role that they can play in their community before they decide to take on the role of a Two-Spirit person. And then I think as well, something else that should just be acknowledged is that sometimes internalized racism can play a part in that. So if someone feels that taking on a Two-Spirit identity as opposed to a more Westernized concept like LGBTQ aligns them more with their indigeneity, that might not be something that's comfortable for them. Again, the impacts of colonialism have really taught many of our Indigenous people that to be Indigenous is a shameful thing, and so some will try to distance themselves from that concept. However, again, just because someone doesn't identify as Two-Spirit does not necessarily mean that there is internalized racism, but that can be a situation for some folks. Okay, so here is sort of an interesting one that comes up quite often when I do any sort of talks, which is that Two-Spirit is not a term to be used by non-Indigenous people. This seems like a fairly straightforward concept, and I would think to most folks in the room it would seem like, well, yeah, obviously. But this is actually not as obvious as we would like it to be. So Two-Spirit is not a term for non-Indigenous people. Because it's so specifically linked to culture, to history, to the experiences of colonization, to that resurgence in our community, for someone to take it on who is not Two-Spirit is actually an act of appropriation. And so, just here with an image of what appropriation looks like in action. So this is a quote from Michelle Cameron, who is a social worker who graduated from UBC's social work program in I think like 2006, 7, 8, something like that. And so the quote I'll just read out in case not all can see it is, when people do not see the harm in sharing the term Two-Spirit, they are missing the point and refusing to recognize that by appropriating the term, they will inevitably alter its cultural context. So what Michelle is saying here is that when people take on the term when it doesn't actually fit you, when you don't share that history, when you don't share that culture, you're actually altering what that term means. You're changing the meaning because you don't actually share so many of the things that define what Two-Spirit actually is. And something that I do like to note when I show this picture, and particularly as a light-skinned Indigenous person myself, as I did actually do the research on this photo, so that this person is not actually Indigenous identified. This is part of their outfit for going to a music festival down in the States. And the headdress has become a very popular, fashionable item that many folks have appropriated in the last few years. This, however, is not appropriation. So I don't know how many folks in the room have seen the movie Smoke Signals, but I just think that this is a super cute photo. It came out and was circulating around Halloween. So when you dress up as an icon from within your own culture, not appropriation. So this is just a really sweet example of that I love. Have folks seen this movie? Yeah? Okay, all right. All right, so just to talk a bit about, not a bit, that's kind of the crux of the whole thing, is the impacts of colonization on Two-Spirit people. So we do actually need the cultural and the historical context to be able to understand and support the well-being of Two-Spirit people today, both in our communities and also in our practice, depending on what kind of work we do. So there was an attempted erasure of Two-Spirit people from Indigenous culture as a result of European settlers coming over here. And the Christian values brought over by European settlers, they really looked down on any sort of gender or sexual diversity and considered it to be a sin or an abomination. And I say attempted erasure here because the mission to erase Two-Spirit people was not successful, because we are still here. There is a great deal of incredible work coming out of Two-Spirit communities. Two-Spirit people are coming back into their roles as healers, as educators, as aunties, as warriors within their own communities, and so it was not a successful attempt, but it was just that. It was a very large attempt. Now you can't really see the background, however, like maybe when you see it on the website or a copy of the PowerPoint is circulated, you'll be able to tell that there's a painting that's sort of superimposed on the background. So this painting, if you can sort of kind of see it, it's a painting of Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who came across homosexuality when he came. This picture is actually depicting a scene from Panama when he came over. And he had come across a bunch of folks who were identified as homosexual at the time, who were Indigenous folks of the territory. And what he did when he found them was that he gathered them all up and then he threw them to the war dogs. And that's actually what this painting is depicting. It's in these bright, beautiful colors, and it's quite a disturbing scene. However, this is some of the history that exists out there of what Two-Spirit is and was. So one of the great tools that was used to really attempt that erasure of Two-Spirit people was the Indian residential school system. It was really used as a gender policing tactic. So in the residential schools, there was physical segregation of boys and girls in the school. And by separating siblings, it made it easier to stop them from speaking their language, made it easier to stop them from practicing any sort of ceremony. And so not only that, but it also, it separated them in terms of gender. It enforced some sort of a gender binary there. So the children there were forced to adapt to clothes, to roles, to hairstyles, to behaviors of what was considered appropriate for European boys and girls at the time. And so something really interesting about this photo that's shown here of this child is probably about 8 or 9. It's actually captured from a PSA that would circulate in newspapers at the time. And it was advertising the benefits of sending your children away to residential school. and saying everything that it could do for your child. So this child, we don't actually know necessarily if this child was Two-Spirit identified, but what we do know is regardless of the role that they played in their community or how they were identified in their community, their clothing, their hair, and likely some of the roles that they played in their community were considered gender diverse to European settlers. And so this was considered something that would needed to be, changed to an appearance that was a little bit more, acceptable in terms of what your little European boys would look and act like. So I just want to share this quote here. It's from some work that Alex Wilson did back in the early 2000s. I'll just read it out for anyone who can't see it. And this quote is from a group of Two-Spirit folks that were gathered together to tell their stories about their experience as Two-Spirit people, of coming out, of coming into their families and communities, and what their experiences were sort of coming into a Two-Spirit identity. So the quote is, "The first thing they did was divide us by boy, girl. Girl go this way, boy go this way. Girl wear pinafores, boy wear pants. All haircut. I didn't really know which side to go to. I just knew that I wanted to be with my sisters and my brother. I'd never worn a dress before, so I went with my brother. It was like a little factory. One priest shaved my head, while another tore off my clothes. I was so scared. I covered my area. It didn't take long for them to notice, and that was my first beating." So I think that this quote, it really captures what it looks like when there is that attempted erasure of any sort of gender diversity and some of the reasons that homophobia and transphobia have really come forward as a result of that colonization tactic. And so this photo here at the bottom is a photo of some children from the Fort Simpson Residential School in the Northwest Territories, and that is a school that many of my family members, including my aunties, uncles, and parents, were sent in the 60s. So this photo has particular meaning for me. So what do those impacts look like today? So those impacts today look like the ways homophobia and transphobia and misogyny have really entered our Indigenous communities as part of Christian religions being imposed at contact. And we really can't do decolonizing work without talking about Two-Spirit. Because that was one of the things that was taken from us. It was one of those things that were almost erased. And we also can't talk about Two-Spirit without talking about decolonization. These two things go hand in hand. So when we're doing any sort of this work, it's really important to be able to bring up both. If you're ever at a talk where they're talking about Two-Spirit and like, oh, it's different than LGBT and blah, 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 we really need to make sure that when we're talking about this, that we're going into deeper conversations about what that history is and why Resurgence is so important to Two-Spirit communities now. And also, similarly, when we're talking about reconciliation, reclamation, decolonization, we can't be leaving our Two-Spirit people out of that because they were something that was attempted to be taken away. And so if we're going to reclaim everything, we need to reclaim our Two-Spirit people too. And so, again, some of those impacts is increased rates of homophobia and transphobia in some Indigenous communities, not in all. There's some amazing work going on in so many Indigenous communities around welcoming in their Two-Spirit people. And to be honest, sometimes when it's more obvious or overt, it's a learned behavior. But when we actually have gender diverse people in our Indigenous communities, sometimes it's just the homophobia and transphobia isn't necessarily attributed to them because it's considered just a regular part of life, but it's when we have those outside influences that homophobia and transphobia really comes out because there's this expectation that that's how we're supposed to behave, and it was really ingrained as part of that residential school and religious experience. And so I think that it's really important to remember that when we're doing work in Indigenous communities, or even just doing our own self-work, that homophobia and transphobia are not traditional values. Those things did not come traditionally from our communities. Just talking a little bit about some of the impacts of homophobia and transphobia on our communities is that it is kind of a contentious idea, this homophobia and transphobia, when we're talking about it in our Indigenous communities. And I recently had a discussion about the idea of transphobia with a colleague. And so we were talking about the use of of the term transphobia when we're working with young people, when we're working just with the larger transgender community. And often the term transphobia, it kind of throws you off because it's not a legitimate phobia. It's not diagnosable in the DSM. And there's this idea of like gay panic, or it's often used as an excuse for violence against our community. And so really a more fitting term when we're doing work around working within trans communities is anti-trans bias, anti-trans hate. And so that really struck me, and I was like, oh yeah, right on, that's great. That's exactly what those words really fit. That makes a lot more sense. And then until I started thinking about the ways that homophobia and transphobia also plays out in Indigenous communities. Is that while, again, I wouldn't say that it's diagnosable as a phobia, just based on the criteria in the DSM, I would say that it's a legitimate fear, and a lot of that legitimate fear is coming from PTSD, from a lot of the same-sex violence that occurred as part of the residential schools. And so, like, a lot of that sexualized violence was same-sex trauma. And you can see the way some of that has impacted our communities to this day. And so I think that when we use that lens and we say like, oh no, it's hate, it's bias, it's bigotry, I think that we need to go a little bit deeper than that sometimes when we're working in our Indigenous communities and recognizing some of the ways that abuse has harmed our communities. So for instance, I have this story about this youth that I worked with a few years ago, and he was just coming out to his family as gay, and he was still living at home with his family. He was in his early 20s. And he'd just come out, and it really, as can do, it sort of shifted the dynamic between him and the older generation in his family, so his aunties and uncles and his parents. And so that weekend or the next weekend or something, he was helping his uncle move. And so they were moving into this new apartment, and he's, passing boxes back and forth with his uncle, and as he passes the boxes back and forth, he accidentally, unintentionally, just puts his hand over top of his uncle's hand, and his uncle just drops the box and goes flying back about 4 feet. And just had this look of absolute terror in his face. And I think that when we're talking about bias and hate and bigotry, there's so much more than that going on in that scenario. And I mean, this youth, like, I've stayed in touch with them, and they have done a lot of work within their family, and they actually have a pretty incredibly supportive family now, but recognizing that a lot of this comes from a source of pain, of violence, of intergenerational trauma. Not historical trauma, because this trauma is still alive and well, but intergenerational trauma that's really impacted that family, and the fear that comes up with any sort of same-sex contact or relationship. So, where are we now, and how do we move forward? So I think that because how we were hurt is our culture being taken away, and our practices being taken away, and our ability to know ourselves being taken away. This is how we were hurt, and so this is how we are going to heal, is by getting our culture back. So the very thing that brought Indigenous communities to a place of great hurt was the attempted theft of culture and cultural practices. So it really only makes sense that these basic elements of culture and cultural practices be restored to bring us back to a place of wellness within our own communities. And I personally believe very strongly that education and dialogue is something that has a great power to guide us in that healing process. So we're really going to switch gears here, and anyone who does gender and sexual diversity trainings, just brace yourself for a moment. The genderbread person. So, have folks seen this diagram before? Yeah? Okay. Okay, so like a good 2/3 of the room, I would say. So the genderbread person is a very standard diagram that's used in gender and sexual diversity education. What it does is it explains the basics of gender diversity, and I'm going with the very first version because it's the most rudimentary and really just sort of gets to the heart of some of the differences between how we would do education in Indigenous communities versus mainstream communities when we're talking about more Westernized LGBT concepts. So what this diagram does is it breaks down your gender identity. So your gender identity is your self-concept, how you consider yourself to be man, woman, genderqueer, anything around in between or beyond. Your gender expression is how you express yourself to the world, so it's your mannerisms, your appearance. Your biological sex is what was declared to the world when you were born. And then at the very bottom is sexual orientation, so that describes how you relate to other people, your sexual romantic relationships with people. And so for those who do know it really well, have you heard some critiques about it? And if so, what are they? Yes.
I haven't heard any. I haven't seen this. I grew up in the States. I'm not familiar with this. But one thing is that it looks like it's a linear situation.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so it is. It's a very linear diagram. And I think like they have come out with further versions after this based on some critiques, but again, like just going with this very first version where it all started, where it all started for this diagram, because that's the critique, is that this diagram is actually able to be created based on so many dialogues that happen around our communities. It's our conversations in living rooms, it's our own personal struggles and trying to figure out where we fit within ourselves and within the world. And a lot of this information was taken by someone who was a cis ally and created into a diagram. They've benefited greatly from this. And that is one of the great critiques, is that this is community knowledge that's now been attributed to one person. It is incredibly limiting. It also, when we're talking about two-spirit identity, there is nowhere on here for culture, there is nowhere on here for spirituality, there's nowhere on here for the social context of how you fit within your community, for the role that you play within your family, which is really integral to what two-spirit means. And so often, like when I have a longer presentation, I will actually go through facilitating this and placing myself on here, and then draw attention to the fact that I've now been talking about myself and my life for like 15 minutes and was not able to address anything around being Indigenous or two-spirit in that last 15 minutes because there is absolutely no place for it. So this is a very Eurocentric, Westernized concept of gender that is not inclusive of any sort of Indigenous identity at all whatsoever. Any other critiques that anyone wanted to share? Yes.
Yeah, just that it asks you to completely separate your body from your element of living in the world. And so it's very siloed in all of these, and it doesn't allow for that overlap or that integration of the elements.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, it separates that self from body. And again, like that's something that's going to be counter to any sort of two-spirit identity, is really just living within your body, living within your own skin, and having that be an extension of the earth and your family and your community. It is very separating. Separating? That's not even a word. Neither of them are words. Let's just roll with it. Separating. So this is a this is a gender diagram that's used pretty commonly in gender diversity trainings. However, here's the thing, is that when I am talking to you, we can rip this thing to shreds, we can talk all about it, we can really explore this and point out all the problems. However, if I'm going to a very small town where there are parents who very much adhere to a gender binary within their community, they think that gay and transgender are the same thing. They think that their kids are so gay that they must be transgender, and just the concept of anything beyond male and female being the exact same thing as man and woman. And if I go into a small town speaking with parents who are still struggling with being able to differentiate between gay and transgender, and they have a young person at home who's at risk of being kicked out, if I go in there and I say, okay, so sit down folks, we're gonna explore what it means to be polyromantic, we're gonna explain non-binary, we're gonna explain all of these things that are part of our well-being, they're part of our identities, they are part of being seen, recognized, and walking down the street, moving within our own communities. However, when I need to start simple with someone, we need to really get down to the basics, and that youth's well-being, regardless of whether whether they're being seen as a polygender person, is really kind of small potatoes compared to if they're going to be able to sleep at home tonight if their parents just get what transgender means at the very basic level. And so, although there are these critiques, there are some environments where I still will go with the most basic version of this chart so that parents just get it, to create some sense of safety for their young people. And I do come up against that critique as well, like even within my own community of gender diversity educators. And I will hear like, oh, why is it's not inclusive, like it doesn't represent our community. But you know what, when I'm going out to that small town, it's not about representing our larger community, it's about keeping that youth with a roof over their head. And so that's why I need to start where I start in some educational environments. And so, oh, whoopsie, I have 2 pages of this. Is that what's going on? Okay. So, here's something else, is that what might folks identify as problematic about this diagram? and by the way, this is a northern version of the genderbread person. It's developed by the sexual health program or sexual health department of the government of Nunavut. So can folks identify something that's problematic about this diagram?
It's confusing.
Okay, so something that that I really, really loved to do, I would say about a year or so ago, is that I would pull up this diagram and I would say, look, okay, you know how we talked about how that last diagram was coming from a Westernized perspective. It was so basic, it doesn't incorporate cultural practices, it doesn't incorporate role, it doesn't incorporate any of these things that it means to be Two-Spirit. And then so we, as an Indigenous community, go and we have the opportunity to recreate this tool, and we actually recreate it in a way that is still not inclusive of Two-Spirit identities. There is still nowhere for spirituality, there is still nowhere for culture, there is still nowhere for your role in your community. The only difference is the person is a little bit browner and is wearing a parka. And this, to me, I used to love to stand here and say, like, look at this. Look, this is actually just colonization in action. Look at that. We haven't even taken the opportunity that we had in front of us to reinvent this. And so I would facilitate that. And it, you know, after a few months, I started to worry. I was like, okay, well, you know, like, what if I go and facilitate that and there's someone in the room who's from the sexual health department at the government of Nunavut, like, and I would feel terrible about that. I don't want to be down talking their tool here, and so I'm really concerned about this. So I better get in contact just to make sure I'm clearing the air. And so I phone them up and I speak to somebody at the sexual health department in Nunavut, and here's what they explained to me. They said, here's the thing, is that within our own communities, we are just starting, and we need to keep things at the basic. We need to make sure that our youth are not losing their housing. We need to make sure that we don't speak to our elders and have them go and their brains blow up. We need to start gentle, we need to start basic, and we can't actually push this in any way. We need to be able to just gently go in, and we will build that knowledge as we go. We will talk more about Two-Spirit as we go, but because so much of those stories have been lost, so much of that history has been lost, we need to start slow, we need to start basic, and we need to be gentle. And so that was a story where I felt like a real jerk. So that was actually a pretty phenomenal teaching, that the reason that I still facilitate with this diagram that I feel is a little bit archaic and doesn't really represent us, and then go on criticizing another organization's use of a diagram for the exact same reason, oh my God. So it's been pretty fantastic. So this person that I spoke to, like, of course they know, and we've spoken about, they don't speak for and represent all Inuit people, or all folks who would facilitate this diagram, but they've said, like, when I talk to them, they're like, yeah, I know, like, there's no place for Two-Spirit, I get it, I have the exact same problem with it, however, we need to keep our young people safe and we need to start gentle. So I just think that this is one of those ways that sometimes as a community, especially as educators, especially with folks with that insider knowledge, we need to recognize that that insider knowledge is also great privilege. That not everyone has access to that knowledge. So especially when we're working in rural communities, Indigenous or not all folks have access to language about the nuances of gender, about navigating gendered spaces, about identity. I mean, we might go to a rural community and really someone who would otherwise identify themselves as transgender or as non-gender just says, I was a woman, now I'm a man. It's that simple, or I'm just really, really gay. Because that is the language that they have access to. And I think that sometimes within our communities, we, and even I clearly have gotten caught up in a tendency to shame folks who don't have access to the same knowledge that we do. And we really need to recognize the role that privilege plays in that. And that we actually need to include our entire community, regardless of even just binary genders, because maybe they know all the options, but it really is a binary gender experience for them, and that's how they identify. And we need to make sure that we are including all of our community members, nuanced or not. So, just to go in a little bit deeper to actual Two-Spirit education and the research that I'm going to be doing. So as Erin had said, I am currently doing my MSW at Dalhousie University. So I'm just getting into the thesis part of it now. It's pretty exciting work, really big work. I've just decided in the last 24 hours to maybe scale it back a bit. But this is how can you save the world with your MSW, Kyle? Okay, so. So this is just sort of the basics of the research that I'm doing. So what I'm interested in exploring is, are there traditional teaching methods that Two-Spirit folks are using in their workshops, their presentations, their community dialogues? So when folks are doing presentations just like this, so doing Two-Spirit education, are there methods that they're using? Do they use storytelling? Do they use humor? How are they getting their message across? And are these traditional ways of teaching? Because again, storytelling and humor are very traditional ways of passing on lessons, of passing on teachings to other folks in their communities. I also want to know, how do educators see themselves playing a sacred role in their community? Do they, again, when I was talking about Two-Spirit, folks often feeling like they need to come in or step into a role as a Two-Spirit person. Is this a way that some people are feeling that they're stepping into a role as a Two-Spirit person, is taking on the role of educator in their communities? And I'm also just wondering, has taking on a role as a Two-Spirit educator deepened your own sense and connection to your own culture and a greater understanding of your own history? So their objectives, like basically what I'm hoping to get out of it, and what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to acknowledge the role of Two-Spirit educators in taking on this sacred role on behalf of our communities, because, you know, like, spoiler alert, I actually do think that we are taking on a sacred role in our communities by sharing these teachings, by sharing them with each other, by sharing them not only within our own communities, but also within the wider community as well. And I also would just like to create an understanding of the variety of teaching methods that are being used by Two-Spirit educators. And one of the reasons I'm wanting to do that is because for many of our people, for many of our young people, like I was saying, is that they feel that taking on a Two-Spirit identity is not necessarily something they can do until they identify a way of being as a Two-Spirit person. And this just can create one more option. Is that, you know, this is a relevant piece of healing work for them to be doing, is to be doing education as a Two-Spirit person. And also just increasing the sense of purpose and direction for those of us who are doing Two-Spirit education, or for those young people who are stepping into an education role and saying, like, look, what you're doing is actually incredible healing work in your community. Keep doing it, deepen your understanding, really throw yourself into it, see how your authenticity can come through in your own education. And also, again, just sort of hoping that it's going to create more opportunities and more visibility for Two-Spirit education. Because Two-Spirit education has often been tacked on to just general diversity trainings. In the last however many years since we've been doing sort of gender and sexuality diversity training, it sort of like gets a mention in there, but it just really gets tacked on to the larger LGBTQ and doesn't really get that cultural, spiritual component explored. So, we're onto the pretty slides. So just to talk a little bit about some of the incredible work that is being done by Two-Spirit people now. And I like to focus on this because so much of the time when we talk about Two-Spirit, we do hopefully focus on the impacts of colonization, but a lot of the time we stop there. And we don't talk about what the incredible work is that Two-Spirit people are doing now. How are they coming into a Two-Spirit identity? And the concept of coming in, if you've heard me use that term a few times now, can be attributed to Dr. Alex Wilson, who is a Cree scholar. And so the idea of coming in really is about stepping into a role as a Two-Spirit person, whereas in sort of the LGBTQ sort of mainstream, we come out at great risk in distancing ourselves from possibly our families and our culture. But when we come in as Two-Spirit people, we actually come into our families and our culture. Hopefully our families, if that acceptance and inclusion is there. So, speaking to Resurgence. So I really cannot go into speaking about Resurgence without acknowledging the work that's being done and has been done. So I just want to acknowledge that there is a great amount of Two-Spirit people out there in the front lines. Many people who have been volunteering at the camps previous to now, many people who are out at the camps now. Even when you're watching the video footage of the gates being taken down, there are Two-Spirit faces that I know of people there. The Two-Spirit people are very much on the front lines of doing this work. And so just incredible gratitude to them for doing this work. And also I will, at some point, have many more slides around Two-Spirit activism that's happening. I'm just getting started on it right now. So the one person I was able to verify their permission and share their work was a great mentor to me, which is Jeffrey McNeil Seymour, who is Tk'emlúps-Shishwetmec First Nation and has done a great amount of work in terms of water and land protection on his own traditional territory, as well as advocating within other territories, and also recently provided expert witness testimony at the Iqaluit Annual of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. And some other really cool people doing some cool stuff. So Dr. James McCocus is a TwoSpirit doctor out in Satellite Cree Nation in Alberta. I think he works mainly out of Edmonton as well. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
Okay, great, excellent, thank you. So he provides gender-affirming care to trans and Two-Spirit people from a traditional healing perspective as well. So he does some incredible work to actually ensure that Two-Spirit people are able to receive traditional medicines and engage themselves in ceremony in a way that is still recognizing of their transgender identity. And James McCocus is Cree as well. Jack Saddleback is also Samson Cree Nation from Alberta, and he works out in Saskatchewan. He's an incredible public speaker. I had the chance to see him back in May in Vancouver. He's a mental health advocate and advocates quite widely within student and university environments as well. He's down here. And Ayana Miracle, who is an artist from Six Nations, Ontario, who didn't identify herself as a Two-Spirit woman, but instead named herself as a transformed Indian woman who loves women. And so the amazing thing about Ayana Miracle, aside from this incredible photo of her, is that she is one of the prominent Two-Spirit folks who are, all of their stuff is out at the Trans Archives here. And so I've been spending some time with her this week with her archives. I've gone through sort of like the everyday kind of little knick-knack smaller items of her life, and also her artwork, her journal entries, and just what an incredible donation she made to the archives. Just absolutely beautiful. So just really getting to know her this week has been an absolute pleasure. Gwen Benaway is an incredible Métis Two-Spirit poet who's Anishinaabe trans woman as well, and has done some extensive writing about her own experience of gender transition, and also particularly as a lighter-skinned Indigenous person as well. The Brush Arbor Girls are a Native American drag troupe. They're down in the States, and they actually incorporate a lot of traditional performance into their drag numbers. And then also this is a painting by Kent Monkman, who's done some incredible artwork, was also speaking here at the Moving Trans History Forward 2018 conference, so I had a chance to see him, which was pretty fantastic, and does quite a lot of Two-Spirit and gender diverse representations in his artwork. And also in general, there's just some really cool things happening around the community. So locally, nationally, there's gatherings, there's events. If you'll note here, this is the 31st annual International Two-Spirit Gathering. So this has been happening for this year. It'll be coming up on 32 years that Two-Spirit people have been gathering. And that's actually where the term Two-Spirit came from, was at this gathering, people wanting to come up with a word that would identify us within our own community besides just LGBT Native. And that's where this term was come up with in like the early 1990s. A bunch of community leaders decided on this term together. Two-Spirit Sweat Lodge. There's actually three Two-Spirit Sweat Lodges in Vancouver, and two of them are actually run by trans Two-Spirit Sweat Lodge keepers as well, which is pretty amazing. And also just in general, just an increase within Indigenous and LGBTQ community organizations, really increasing their representation for Two-Spirit folks. So again, this is sort of a dual hand-in-hand thing. So it's both within friendship centers, band offices, Indigenous community spaces, but then also within those larger LGBTQ community spaces, doing some of that decolonizing work that needs to happen. So, about that, just a side note on good intentions that I just want to speak about. When you're out moving around in community, or if any of you work for community organizations, a lot of the time, creating a Two-Spirit inclusive space for community organizations looks like, ta-da, we're inclusive. So often they just tack on the two into their acronym, and that's about it. So that can be pretty dangerous, because what that means is that Two-Spirit people may be coming in there to access services expecting that there's a particular amount of accountability and competency for working within a decolonizing framework, and that can be a real setup. So for instance, when I have this slide other places, sometimes I'll place on flyers from different Pride events. There's something that I often pull up that's a parenting group that says it's LGBTQ+. If this parenting group, I really have my doubts that this parenting group for queer and trans folks is also having a segment where they sit down and address the loss of parenting skills that happened through the 60s scoop in residential families. That's likely not a part of their programming. as well as queer and trans university discussion groups that have a 2 in their acronym, and just really questioning whether those discussion groups are sometimes structured as a talking circle, and whether they are actually inclusive of any sort of Indigenous discussion structures. So yeah, I think it's something that we need to be really intentional about. Don't put up your 2 in your acronym until you know you're actually accountably serving that 2 within the acronym. And this is something that we've gone through within the trans community. It's something that we referred to for many years as the silent T, and also still referred to as that there's a T at the end of the acronym, but like, where are we? No one's here to serve us. No one actually knows how to work with us. And so again, just something to continuously be aware of as we continue adding letters and numbers to the acronym. So just the last couple of things I wanted to highlight. So this is the film that I spoke about a little bit earlier, Two Soft Things, Two Hard Things. It's a feature documentary that explores the complexities of a remote Arctic community holding a queer pride celebration. Which, I mean, there are some interesting dynamics in there, just around how homophobia and transphobia came to have such a role in the community, and why there was a struggle, and whose role it is to reclaim that. So you may watch it and be like, I don't know, some things didn't quite sit right, but just being able to watch a community go through that process is also pretty incredible, and then also being able to hear some of the stories of what gender and sexual diversity historically looked like in Inuit communities is pretty fantastic. So I definitely highly recommend it, but also sort of keep that critical lens on as well. Mani Chakabi, Oji Cree queer woman, wrote a book about her journey into healing. Wawate Fobister, who is Anishinaabe, has this incredible play called Agokwe. I haven't seen it, I've seen parts of it, heard amazing things about it. It's been toured all over the place, highly recommended. It seems like a pretty amazing play. So see, we're doing a lot of stuff. So we're doing a lot of really cool, fun stuff. So that's why I'm just so fascinated by us as Two-Spirit people, and recognizing like all of this is healing, because this is connecting Inuit people with ideas of what gender and sexual diversity used to be like. This is connecting people with being celebratory, going out, enjoying the arts, being able to see representations of themselves and their own struggles as queer and trans Indigenous people. Being able to have your own healing journey validated. All of these ways that we're representing ourselves in society are acts of healing. And it is, again, why I'm so interested in how us as educators can really validate our identity as healers within our communities, and continue doing this good work. So I think that's about it for me. Here's a reference list, just write that down real quick. I think this will be circulated because it's part of the presentation. And that's about it for me. Time up. That means that's it. Ininuktitu. And Masicho means thank you in Dene. So thank you very much for having me.